What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's explore everything you need to know about Polaris, Horseman of Pestilence in Marvel's Snap. Polaris, Horseman of Pestilence is a 2/2 with an objective that says when there is -5 points of power applied to the board, you pull a card from your hand. At 2 cost, she seems like a natural fit in the Afflict shell, which is typically light on high leverage 2 costs, and also potentially in high evolutionary. The key thing with Polaris is balancing her setup and her payoff. This is actually a card that I didn't feel super comfortable playing out early often, because if I played Scorpion, my opponents were able to control when she went off. It was actually much better for me to play Polaris after emptying my hand as one of the cards coming down late in the game. I was struck by this. This is a card that I play as a big statted 2 cost a lot of the time. In as much as it is going to be a card that you play, the fact that you say, play this and then a Shang-Chi is actually a pretty important part of the wheelhouse this card has. The fact that it can represent a lot of power for only 2 energy means that it can pair with more things than you think. On the whole, though, there are a couple of interactions you should know about before you start deck building with Polaris, Horseman of Pestilence. Interaction number 1 is a -1. This does not work the way you want. Caliban, Horseman of Pestilence, will apply a -7 debuff, which in theory should trigger Polaris. A Pestilence Horseman working with a Pestilence Horseman, what could be better? Unfortunately, all objectives resolve using the exact same timing, so it is not possible for an objective card to trigger another objective card if they are both checking on the same turn. In other words, you have to turn this guy on by turn 5 if you want him to trigger Polaris on turn 6. This, to me, is the kind of thing that strikes me as a potential oversight. Mysterio, on the other hand, not an oversight, just a refresher. Now, it may look like what Mysterio is doing is afflicting a card with -5. I can see how you'd think that, but there actually is in the game a difference between afflict and set. And you can see this with, for example, Valkyrie and Abomination from High Evolutionary. Valkyrie can set things to below their base power, which would make their power red, which is the same visual indicator as an afflict, but it doesn't count for High Evo Abomination because it is a set and not an afflict. The same dynamic is at play for Polaris. She is looking for actual afflicts, not set to less. Finally, repeatable afflicts are actually quite useful. Cyclops in High Evolutionary, for example, felt much better compared to how he feels with Abomination. This is because you will be able to count vertically with Polaris, where Abomination only counts horizontally. If you afflict the same thing with -2, -2, -2, guess what? That's 6 Polaris triggers, whereas Abomination, not so much. So the ability to make Polaris happen does feel notably easier than High Evo Abomination, in large part because she works well with these repetitive afflicts. So let's get into some decks. I actually had a preposterously good record with a preposterously mid deck. As you can see, High Evolutionary is still High Evolutionary. This is the list I ended up on, and it felt very middling, like the kind of thing that has some answers that can meaningfully line up into this metagame, but a lot of the time, you're really just counting on your opponent being way too cocky and staying into things that they probably shouldn't stay into. There's room for experimentation here, though, because it didn't feel nearly as bad as I was used to High Evolutionary feeling. Like, Polaris is actually genuinely just good here. You get all this stuff where it's like, I have the ability to, like, get rid of stuff in my hand and use the extra energy that I get from a Star-Lord, which is minimal, in order to get a Polaris and a Hulk, and then the Polaris pulls like a Laufey or a Shang-Chi, and it's like, wait, that's actually kinda nice with it. It makes your very minimal Star-Lord investment feel like a lot more of a real thing. And I do think that like there does seem to be like something actually here in this shell in a way that I didn't expect. And the biggest reason for that is that this deck is really genuinely good at making Polaris free as just a thing that it does, and really genuinely good at just fitting her into your later turns. Like if you use a Star-Lord, it's probably going to be for 2 or 3 energy, but that means you get Hulk Polaris, and that's actually kind of nice, especially if it means you're floating another bit of energy for your Cyclops and your Misty Knight to trigger. It's not perfect, but you are like a real deck here. Now, the other thing that she brings to this deck, and this is actually maybe the most important thing she brings to this deck, is just she costs 2. That's actually just a really important thing. There are going to be games where you're like, which direction am I going? How much am I playing on curve? How much am I playing off curve? Normally, I just try to make sure I'm getting a couple energy out of the Star-Lord. Unless he's in my hand, I'm not skipping every turn. If he is in my hand, yeah, I mean, I'll think about skipping all the way up with the curve to him, and then I'll play, you know, Shang-Chi and a Hulk, and that will be kind of okay. This is a deck that is extremely capped, but it does have general interactive tools. Shang-Chi and Red Guardian are the ones that I'm playing here, as well as Iceman for mild disruption. I think all of those are arguable. If you want to put a Juggernaut in here, that makes perfect sense to me. If you want to go something different at the 1-cost slot, maybe a Spider-Ham also makes perfect sense to me. Tons of different options you can try in the shell. Largely, it felt to me like much more of a real deck than I expected it to feel. Like, I literally had a 70% win rate over like 40 games up to like rank 24. It was like kind of a good run, but it felt like kind of a good run in the way that like sometimes you can get lucky with a fairly mediocre mid-range deck and just kind of do okay. And while I do think that it's notable that Evo has gotten into that vein, I don't really think that this is going to be the next world beater. The vending machine is open. This was actually a deck I saw a pretty decent amount of. I traced it back to Splat, which makes a ton of sense. The basic premise here is that Marrow, at any point discarded, is going to trigger Polaris, and this is a deck in the form of normal discard that is basically always going to have a guy in hand who kinda sucks. The best thing you can possibly do with this deck is get double Apocalypse, right? Like, that's what you really want to be doing here. You're probably not going to do that because you are going to MODOK on 5, and that is when the Marrow is going to be used. But maybe you'll be able to top deck that Polaris and play it. The nut draw doesn't happen a lot, but you do have a lot of guys who are just in hand, and Marrow auto-triggering Polaris, pulling a Weapon H, pulling a Khonshu, pulling pretty much anything in this deck is very reasonable. This is a deck that is entirely built around MODOK, though. You really don't have anything that this deck has access to unless you have MODOK, unless you have Corvus Glaive, and in rare occasions, Zombie Power Man. Now, this is actually a very good Zombie Power Man deck because approximately every card you could ever possibly play in this deck, give or take, is just a card you want to discard off ZPM. So what's going on here effectively is just, we're going to turbo all of the cards in our hand onto the board. That's the entire thing that is happening here. It's almost Hela-esque in terms of the way it tries to play the game, and I do think it ends up comping a bit low for Hela, but it's definitely a way to play this card that I had not seen anyone else do. Polaris caring about the depth of Afflict makes things like Scream fairly interesting as pairings with her. The problem you run into with a deck like this is one of Polaris's most enduring problems, though, because you have your enablers for Polaris. She's doing cool stuff in your mid-range deck. You trigger Polaris on the final turn of the game, and she pulls a Kingpin. And you're like, why am I going out of my way to do this? And the answer is you really aren't. Like, you're a very good deck at afflicting. Laufey can trigger her basically on his own in a full enough lane. Scream with enough time will automatically trigger her. You really don't even kind of need the Kingpin. Maybe you could swap it out for a Magneto just so you have more things to actually do. Prowler can afflict -4 some of the time thanks to his remote mines. You have legit options here. It's just that you're not making a great use of the ability Polaris has. She's a nice 2-drop here, but honestly, this feels like using her to do an impression of Archangel almost. You remember the Archangel deck that I was playing last week? And it was like, I'm doing well, but this doesn't really feel like a thing. And Archangel's basically just a 2/7 every game, and that's fine, but not exciting. Scream, exactly the same position. You're probably going to get her to be a 2/7. And granted, Scream kind of cares about having a 2/7, but this is not a compelling reason to go out of your way to make it happen. I think maybe if we rework the list a little bit, try to get Magneto in here, make things a little heavier, this becomes another one of those high Evo style mid-range decks that are like very definitively tier 2-ish. You can win with them. Somewhere between tier 2 and tier 3 rogue decks that you can play games of Marvel Snap with. And then, you have to rely on various tricks in order to beat the super popular decks, but you have options, right? Like you have the ability to jack up Star-Lord gamers by moving their stuff around. You have the ability to jack up all sorts of show allow gamers by doing the same thing. There's upsides here. You can play games of Marvel Snap. It's really not that horrible, but that's not a selling point. That's not a sales pitch. If I'm saying it's fine, that's not what you're looking for from a card. This is a deck where her non-interaction or her bad interaction with Caliban really legitimately hurts her, because Doom 2099 is a deck that typically has some pretty big things in hand that it would be happy to cheat onto the board. It is a deck that loves having things on the board. It is a deck that is super happy to get a 2-drop after the nerf to Chamber. There are a lot of things that would make you want to be a Polaris gamer, and yet this interaction really holds her back, because Caliban is not a reliable trigger for her. If she is relying on Caliban, they will happen at the same time, which means further deck building sacrifices need to be made. We see the Man-Thing here paired with Spider-Woman. That's reasonable. I don't think this is bad. I can see the argument for cutting some tech out of the Doom 2099 deck and getting more power in. And this deck does meaningfully do that. I do think that Ika hit on a fairly good way to incorporate this card into a strategy that actually will benefit from it. This is a good small package, and it's really not that bad if you're missing, because the rest of the deck is very happy to pick up the slack. Having that additional gigantic 4, like Man-Thing is quite a good card with this if you can get it in a lane with enough stuff, or just use it for the -2 and let Spider-Woman do the rest. The cost is really the issue. I'm happy to get Polaris in here. That's super fine with me. I'm happy to get Man-Thing in here. I didn't really love Iron Lad in the first place. Those two are fine. Chamber or Sam Wilson becoming Polaris? Sure. Not ideal, but sure. Man-Thing swapping out for Iron Lad? I like it. Losing one of the real 5s to play Spider-Woman, because without that, the rest of this doesn't make sense. That's where you lose me. Like, that's where you start getting into like the actual trade-offs you're making here, right? You are giving up on a Sandman or a Legion in order to do this. And that is a real cost. Now, I do think this is still like a pretty compelling thing to do if you're willing to say, I don't care about Sandman Legion. I do care about having more power in this deck, which is a valid thing to care about. You can do this. I will also say, though, this is the kind of deck where a decent amount of the time your final hand is going to be like a 3, a 6, and another 3. And you're going to feel really dumb if she pulls either of the 3s, basically. Any of them. Last up is the deck that I think everyone would have expected to be first up. This is just a classic little Ajax list. And this is a card, Polaris, that is doing meaningfully good stuff in this deck and really actually genuinely helpful to the game plan. The deck just runs into problems that are related to the archetype, right? Polaris is a great 2-drop in this deck. Like, genuinely, if you like Afflict, I do think this is one of those situations where she is just actively good here. This is a deck that is always making it happen. It is always going to be on. You will always be able to pull something, and very often, especially when you're doing your specific 4 into 5, you're going to pull something that, like, pretty much matters. This deck is gated by how much it's able to play on the later turns of the game. The problem being that you play a 4, you play a 5, and then you play 2 3s, or a 4 and a 2. Polaris is a great 2 if you're doing the 4 and a 2. And if you have her on the board, the 2 3s mean she'll pull, presumably, a 4 onto the board from there. She is helpful here. That is not to say that this is suddenly a good deck because of her, but she does make it better. The issues you run into, well, there's a couple. The first one is, in order to get her in here, you kind of don't want to run Malekith. Malekith's a pretty good card here, but I can understand saying, maybe we're not a Malekith gamer, we're all in on the power, that's totally reasonable. Sure, fine. The second is, it's Polaris release day, so other people are playing Luke Cage, and that's really bad for you. The final thing you run into with a list like this is that this is the kind of deck that isn't built for the current moment. When you think about what made this deck so powerful back in the day, a lot of it was defined by dynamics with Shang-Chi. What this deck was good at doing was throwing priority, and then everything changes. My stuff isn't Shangable until my stuff reveals. We're not in a metagame that is rewarding being good into reactive tech anymore. We're in a metagame where you have to be good against proactive tech. And this deck is much less good at beating proactive tech than it is at beating reactive tech. Getting your Luke Cage blown up, getting your Ajax CGR'd, getting outpointed, that's another thing that can really happen to you. That's the other thing that this deck loses as the metagame gets more combo-oriented. It used to be that you could sort of look at US Agent and you could sort of look at Man-Thing and you could say, these are tech cards. Man-Thing is good against the small ball decks and US Agent is good against things that are going super tall. They're like a soft Shang-Chi and a soft Killmonger. That's awesome. The problem you run into is that the numbers that those cards are, I guess, the things that make them soft, those numbers don't matter as much anymore. Yeah, a Man-Thing is pretty good when they're playing Sholau, but Sholau's going to go over the top of that Man-Thing. And yeah, a US Agent is pretty good when they're playing Star-Lord, but Star-Lord's going to go over the top of that Man-Thing. And it didn't used to be like this for this deck. And those are largely the things that are defining why, even though Polaris does fit here, like I would not be surprised if in however long it takes for this deck to become viable again, she is a part of it. I would not be surprised. She's good here. The deck has fundamental things that prevent it from lining up well into the meta. And that is unfortunate for it. So what's the verdict here? I do think that Polaris is what I think these cards are supposed to be. Like, there's been a lot of to-do about how a lot of these cards are just bad and have no homes, and I don't want to really play them, and, like, that's all sort of true, but I think when you look at how Polaris is a card that, like, does have homes. It's just those homes aren't good. But there's a difference between that and Archangel, who I think genuinely is kind of homeless. This is a card that actually does its job. You release a 2-drop aimed at the Afflict deck. It makes the Afflict deck better. It does that. It makes the High Evo deck better. It does that. I do think it does that, but it doesn't do it by enough. And I think that's sort of the thing that everyone is sort of eliding when they talk about this stuff. These cards don't suck in a vacuum. There's a lot of metagame context to why these cards don't necessarily have tier 1 homes. And I guess the other thing is, do we want cards to have tier 1 homes? I don't know. I think that, a lot of people watching this will be like, yes, I would love for all these cards to have tier 1 homes. I would love to be playing these cards that are coming out more. And then, imagine one of them actually gets good. Suddenly it's like, well, I can't believe they did this, right? I think it's an interesting dynamic, but when you compare it to some of the previous releases in this season, this one actually does its job, right? Like Wolverine Horseman of War and Archangel Horseman of Death, they're clearly aimed at archetypes too, but they're bad in their archetype. Like, they're not helping their deck. Polaris, I think, actually is helping the deck. The deck just isn't that good. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one as long as you remember to like and subscribe.